The election of 1964 was between Democratic candidate Lyndon B. Johnson and Republican candidate Barry Goldwater. Johnson had moderate views and purposely tried to portray Goldwater as an extremist, since Goldwater often openly discussed his stance on the Vietnam War and his support for using nuclear weapons in Asia. Johnson used creative advertisement strategies to help gain support. For example, part of his campaign involved a commercial of a young girl picking daisies before a nuclear bomb exploded. Campaign tactics like these employed an appeal to pathos that helped win over voters by playing on their emotions. In the end, Johnson won the popular vote by 61.1% and beat Goldwater by a whopping 434 electoral votes.
During his campaign, Johnson clearly stated his goal of continued communism. He expressed hesitation to become directly involved in the war, though. Despite his initial reservations, Johnson worked alongside Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara.
Hi, I'm Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense.
And Secretary of State Dean Rusk.
Hi, I'm Dean Rusk, and I'm Secretary of State.
Sends tens of thousands of U.S. soldiers to the foreign lands of Vietnam.
The U.S. government had dispatched more than 180,000 American soldiers to Vietnam by the end of 1965. The American commander in South Vietnam was General Westmoreland. General Westmoreland still requested more troops.
I'm General Westmoreland, and I say more.
Yes. By 1967, over 500,000 U.S. troops were stationed in Vietnam.
General Westmoreland was an experienced guy. He graduated from West Point, the United States Military Academy. He served in both World War II and the Korean War. As the commander of the U.S. Army in Vietnam, he continued to request more troops, since he was unimpressed with the skills and fighting abilities of South Vietnam's army.
The South Vietnamese Army, also known as the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, was weak without the assistance of American troops. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam was almost entirely funded and supplied by the U.S. In the war itself, the South Vietnamese Army supported the United States as best they could, since the United States ended up doing most of the fighting. This was because the South Vietnamese Army failed to impress the higher-ups of the U.S. Army. In fact, these Asian soldiers were hardly skilled at all, the majority being farmers drafted into service. In this video clip, an American soldier carries a helpless Vietnamese soldier.
Vietnam was an unfamiliar terrain for the American soldiers. It was a jungle and often rained for several days on end. The soldiers were also affected by dehydration and diseases such as malaria. Members of the Viet Cong were difficult to discern since many were disguised as regular citizens. Furthermore, the Viet Cong used an elaborate network of tunnels that contributed to the guerrilla fighting strategy. Despite a lack of high-powered weaponry, the Viet Cong used hit-and-run and ambush tactics. The U.S. Army was unfamiliar with this fighting strategy, and the war was only made worse by the horrible conditions. The U.S. Army fought a war of attrition, wearing down the enemy by constant harassment. This was frustrating because the Viet Cong refused to back down. In an attempt to expose the Viet Cong's tunnels, the U.S. dropped napalm bombs and sprayed Agent Orange, injuring citizens and destroying the environment. In further efforts to expose the Viet Cong, the U.S. Army conducted search and destroy missions that ultimately left some of Vietnamese towns in ruins after livestock were killed and houses were burned.
Nguyen Cao Khai was the commander of South Vietnam's Air Force. Nguyen Cao Khai was generally either loved or hated by the Vietnamese. He did not really respect women and tended to be impulsive. He was supportive of democratic reforms and political advancements in Vietnam. However, he established himself as a coward when he and his family fled to the United States on an American plane when North Vietnamese troops began to invade Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam.
As the war progressed, inflation rates skyrocketed, resulting in an increase in war costs. Johnson's initial reaction was to request a tax increase in order to pay for the remainder of the war. Congressional conservatives agreed to Johnson's request, but only after demanding and receiving $6 billion reduction in funding for Great Society programs.
Once optimistic, Americans lost hope in the war effort once the stark pictures that appeared on the TV contradicted what the government had originally told the public. General McClellan and Defense Secretary McNamara even informed the public that the Viet Cong surrender was on its way. Body bags filled with dead American soldiers televised on national television told the public otherwise. As a result, the credibility gap grew between what the Johnson administration reported and what was really happening.
Pull back.
Alex, squat!
Take